People would stand in line for hours, pay hundreds of dollars, if there was a pill that would do for what your kids, what reading out loud does to them.
And I look back and I'm like, but they're so good. Like the Fork Factory. Like the Fork Factory was so good.
You're right.
If you're looking for a book to read out loud to your kids, this series is a great place to start.
God has a dream specifically for you. And if you don't play your part, it won't get played. And if your part doesn't get played, I assure you, souls can be lost. The world doesn't need another John Paul II or Mother Teresa. The world needs you. And your ordinary life has an extraordinary mission. Now is your time.
You're listening to the Extraordinary Mission Podcast with Dr. John Wood. Dr. John Wood is an optometrist, author, speaker, and saint in the making. He has published 3 books and speaks across the country, energizing the church to pursue our extraordinary mission. And now, your host, Dr. John Wood.
Welcome back to the Extraordinary Mission Podcast. I'm John Wood, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about our extraordinary mission of becoming the saints God created us to be in the middle of our ordinary lives. And we're doing a series now with 2 good friends of mine, Phil Slonkosky and Matt Roessner. We were old opponents in high school that we talked about in the last episode about running, but today we kind of want to switch focus on being dads. That's what this whole series is really about. How can we be better dads, inspire other people to be better dads? And one of the things that's worked for all of us that we found is reading out loud to our kids and finding great stories. Life is it's a story. You know, we're part of the greatest story ever told. And I think one of the greatest ways to teach lessons to our kids is to read them stories. There's a lot of secular research out there that says the power of reading out loud to your kids. And so today I want to specifically talk about a story that's kind of impacted all of our families. One of my all-time favorite stories, right up there with the Tolkien stories, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Maybe we'll talk about those sometime. But this particular author was greatly influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, some of the most famous Christian authors in the past. But the author's name is Andrew Peterson. And the series that we're going to talk about today is called the Wingfeather Saga. I remember, I think it was Matt. You introduced this series to me several years ago. So where did you find this series? Because I was blown away. I've never been a very good reader. My wife is amazing. My kids love to read, but I've always struggled with kind of sitting down and actually accomplishing reading a book from cover to cover. But I could not put this book down. Like it actually, I know my kids love it, but I think I loved it more than they did. So tell me, where'd you find this book, and what was your experience about reading it to your kids the first time?
Yeah, so my wife and I have a group of friends from around Mercer County, and we get together once a month and talk about all things Catholic, about just being parents, and mostly it's just about our faith, maybe things about going on in the church or whatever. And one of the dads has a son that's a year older than my oldest son, and he's a voracious reader, and my son reads a lot, and I read a lot. I really like to read, and I hope that's the one thing that one of the things I pass on to my kids is to be a good reader, because I feel like if you're a good reader, you're so much farther ahead. There's probably studies out there that show it. But so anyway, my friend had said, "Hey, my son has been reading this Wingfeather book, On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness." He's like, he can't put it down. He loves it. And I said, "Oh yeah," and I was like, "Oh." Who's it by? And he said, Andrew Peterson. He's a Christian singer, songwriter, and he's got some other books out. So I said, yeah, it doesn't take me much to get me to buy a book. So like Amazon Prime, So I had it in like 2 days. Well, I sat down and I thought, I'm just going to read it first so that, I didn't know what it was. And so I read it, and I probably read it in 2 days, and I was the same way. I couldn't put it down. And it's just amazing. I think it's a lot like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They do such good jobs about character development. And it makes you want to meet these characters. And you become so invested in the story. And I think that's what makes a good story is you become invested in the characters. And going back to our faith, we're all part of this story. And that's what's great about the saints, is that you can become, by learning about the saints, become invested in that story, and it makes your faith that much more alive. And so that's what I thought was so great. Just from the very first book, I was thinking, oh my gosh, like there's so much here, so rich in Christianity and Christology. There's so much there. And so I was like, right away, called my friend, like, this is awesome, and he's like, he's got another one, and so bam, Amazon Prime had it in a couple more days, In the meantime, I had given it to I think my son was 8 at the time, 7 or 8, and he just started reading through it. Well, and then he was talking about it a lot, and that got my other kids excited about, like, what? Fangs of Dang, like, what are you talking about? And sea dragons and just all these terms that they're like, what is this? And I think this is probably like the first dystopian type book any of my kids have really read. We had read a little bit of the Chronicles of Narnia, but some of my little kids were getting lost in it, and so we stopped reading out loud. And so I thought, oh, this would be perfect. So we sat down, and this was one we started going through, and just you could hear a pin drop, against all ages, because it really is, a 5-year-old can understand the book. There might be some, disclaimer on there's some violence.
There's some scary stuff too. I mean, it can be dark at times.
It's definitely, especially as the series goes on.
Yeah.
The first 2 books are pretty lighthearted. They're very witty. And so I like witty humor, I guess, dry witty humor. And Andrew Peterson in the first 2 books especially it does a really good job with that humor. So we loved it in that regard. And yeah, that just made us, boom, boom, boom. All the books were already out by the time we had started reading it anyway. And so we read them in pretty quick succession. Well, then my older daughter had to get in on it too, and she started reading. She didn't want to just wait for me to read it. She went off and read them on her own, and every kid that's read them in our family so far has devoured them.
Awesome. So, what about your experience, Phil? Did you tell, because we introduced this book, you told me about it before I'd even really kind of reconnected with Phil. So I don't know, did you find this book on your own? Was this something that you guys talked about? Or
we got together, I think when we got together, one of the first times when we met in Lima at a restaurant.
Okay.
And we were all just visiting and talking. I mean, we covered so much stuff that night. And one of them was books. And I think both of you guys were like the Wingfeather series.
Okay.
So I think
that was shortly after, maybe within 6 months of me talking to you about it.
Okay.
And that was maybe even the first time you and I saw each other since we talked about it. And so we were probably passionately talking about it.
I think you're right.
And then you're like, what is this series?
I went and clicked on it right away and ordered it and started reading, and it's like, this is awesome.
Yeah. And we talked in the past about critically thinking and wanting our kids to be able to think critically. And one of the things that stories do is kind of maybe gives them some empathy and puts them in other people's shoes sometimes, but also teaches them virtue, teaches them, one of the quotes that Andrew Peterson uses a lot is from G.K. Chesterton. And he said that fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons are real, but because they tell us that dragons can be defeated. So talk about that a little bit, Phil, about how important it is to read stories to our kids, to read stories, to help them to learn to think critically, to problem solve, to see the world maybe with a different eyes.
I think you'll like this analogy.
All right.
If you think about popular culture today, why are Marvel movies so in right now? Okay. People are looking for a hero. People are looking to win, because on the one hand, you have a culture that's a media that's promoting such a negative culture, right? So we're looking for a victory. But what's interesting about a Marvel movie is that there's an ambiguity about what's really good and what's really evil, because we actually love the bad guys, right? Thanos, you feel bad for Thanos. You feel bad for Thanos when he has to push his daughter off the cliff to get the Soul Stone and she dies, even though they confuse you even more by thinking that she kind of self-sacrificed herself, because heck, she's strong enough to really not die, but the fact that Thanos still was able to push her over and she didn't put a fight up. I mean, come on, was she, So the ambiguity is what's dangerous, right? Because the devil lives in lies, and there's a lot of lies in that interaction there. What's great about these books is that there's a very clear good and there's a very clear evil. And not to ruin the ending, but the redemption that comes is quite powerful, right? Because one of the truths of our Catholic faith. So I'm going on a tangent. The thought that I wanted to share was the importance for me for story is that where else do kids get a point of reference by which to look at the world through a lens that allows them to distinguish good from evil, and then make sure that they have the desire to choose the good in spite of an attractive evil. There has to be a context somewhere that a child has to have an experience in their life that allows them, when they're in that encounter, to see that. And what we've lost touch with, and what movies do a great job of doing, is blurring that line. And that's why kids have a tough time choosing good versus bad. They don't understand. There's not a rock. And that's where like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are great examples, because if you read Lord of the Rings, I mean, Sauron is just bad. There is no ambiguity. He is pure evil, and the ring is the ring that binds them all. Mm-hmm. And even, there's a great scene in that book. As you said, we should probably do a podcast all on Lord of the Rings.
We'll do one.
But there's that great scene where, the ring, there's two of them actually. Well, there's more than one, but the two key ones in the story, especially that they represented in the movies, were the one where the ring is being offered to the wizard, right? To Gandalf. Mm-hmm. And he will not touch it, because he knows even if he touches the power, even though he would desire to use it for good, he knows it would corrupt him. I mean, that's like, here's the world, and here is the world. You get to have the world for as long as you live. And he's an immortal, he's an interesting character in terms of, they don't really explain in the movies how he really, he's one of these quasi-immortal beings, really. He's more like an archangel type in a way. And then you have Galadriel, who has to pass the test as well. And that's a very clear distinction. You don't see that in today's movies. I would argue that in the movies today that are really powerful, you do have a clear distinction, and that's why you walk away with a better story. We feel good at the end of a Marvel movie because there's all this action. We're running off more adrenaline and people beating each other up. But in these books, what I appreciate is that Andrew Peterson lays out a very clear story of, here is the good, here is the evil, and these kids have an opportunity to overcome that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the power of redemption, and he's very good at drawing that out in the struggle, and it's written through kids' perspective. So it's a 4-book series, and in my opinion, you can see the development of Andrew Peterson as the series goes on in his writing style. But you said earlier, Matt, you can put yourself in the character's shoes. You can look at it through their eyes, especially if you're a kid growing up, because he doesn't hide their internal struggles. He doesn't hide the things that they're going through. And even the Fangs of Dang, who in this imaginary world, the Fangs are actually people that were human, and they've lost a battle, but they're not beyond redemption, as we see kind of at the end of the story. And especially the main character, the oldest boy, Janner. I heard a quote from Andrew Peterson once where he, and it's interesting, as an author, you are kind of like, through the perspective of God the Father, you're creating a world, you're creating a story. And he said that I looked at Janner and I looked at his life and where I wanted him to be at the end of the story, and I realized that I was going to have to ruin his life. And that was like, wow, that's such a powerful statement about life and about the struggles we go through, and how we say, why did this happen to me, and why is there suffering in the world, and why do bad things happen? But the development of those characters, I thought was beautiful in the story. And so, one of the things I appreciate about Andrew Peterson, and he is, like you said, he's a musician, but you can tell in his stories that he's a storyteller. You can tell in his songs that he's a storyteller, that he's good at teaching truth. So you tell me give me a lecture, I'll forget it within 10 minutes. You tell me a story, I'll remember it for the rest of my life. And I think that's one of the reasons why these stories are especially powerful. So it's a 4-book series. I want to get your guys' opinion. Do you have a particular favorite book? So book 1, On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. Book 2, North or Be Eaten. Book 3, The Monster in the Hollows, and then book 4, The Warden and the Wolf King, which was quite a bit thicker than the first 3. But what do you guys think? Did you guys have a favorite story, and did your kids particular have a favorite part of the series?
Are we allowed to give any spoilers out in here?
You got to be careful. I don't want to give the story away, but it's
those
tough.
answers, it's like hard. As you're asking that question, I'm sitting here thinking, well, how much can we give out? Because part of the fun is seeing where he takes the story, know?
Well, Well, which book was your favorite?
What was your favorite, man?
I think my favorite is probably the final book, The Warden and the Wolf King, mostly because of kind of the themes you guys talked about. You've been with these characters over the struggle of all the other books, and you've seen how they've changed, sometimes physically and emotionally, spiritually, how they're getting a better understanding of things, and where that's taking them, and how they're processing it. I think that was a great line that you said about how Andrew Peterson doesn't hide the emotions that they're feeling. And I think sometimes that's our biggest problem, is that we hide our emotions. I know I'm German Catholic, right? And so that's a big knock on the area, is that people don't emote.
Very stoic.
My wife, she goes on and on, like you never emote. Like, when have you ever cried about anything, you know? But I think that's a problem, is that we hide our feelings, and you're never comfortable around someone enough to really let your guard down and know. And I think he does such a good job, especially among the siblings in the book, that it shows like what a real family's supposed to look like. You know, now their dad's not involved necessarily. I don't want to give too much away, but the relationship those siblings have, and especially when they do certain things, the bond that they have is something that I think is something that we can really learn a lot from, and try to emulate that in our own families, and to help, because there's nothing more that I want for my kids than to have that kind of a bond, to love each other so much that you would do anything for each other. Maybe you're at school and you see your brother or sister getting picked on you, and go stand up for them. You know, kids don't do that today. You know, let alone in their own family, let alone for anybody else. There are not many. I mean, there might be some, but so I really like that about the fourth book. I also liked the fourth book because it had throughout the book interspersed some of the stories about Boniface Squoon. Yeah. And without giving a lot away, he's a very main character in the book, and it's kind of like, how did this guy get to be the way he is? You know, and even the main character, the evil in the book, how did he become evil? And he brings you along that journey. But he sprinkles it. He doesn't just do it in 2 pages. He does it over the course of 500 pages. But he teases you along, and I know I kept just wanting to, like, oh my God.
It's hard to stop at the night, because the way he ends a chapter every night, the kids are like, one more chapter.
That's exactly what my kids say, and it's like, we've already been reading for 20 minutes. We're done. You know, time for bed. But that's what I liked about the book. Now, I also really liked the second book, North or Be Eaten. That was my second favorite book, and I was asking my son, my 10-year-old. He loves these books, and he's like, I got to reread these. But he was saying he loves North or Be Eaten, and mostly because of the second child, the king, what happens to him, and how his character changes, but that doesn't change who he is on the inside. And over the whole saga of the books, that's something I really like about what Andrew Peterson's teaching us, is that, you know, it's like we need to see people as God sees people. And you don't see people for how their appearance is on the outside. You see it how God sees it, and he looks at the heart. You know, I think it was 1 Samuel when Samuel is, you know, anointing David, and he says, this is the guy, you know, this ruddy guy. And he's like, listen, I don't see as you see. I look at the heart. And I think the characters do a great job at that in this book. And I think it starts in book 2 and culminates in book 4 that you really see that. And
because of Kalmar's struggle, he can empathize, you know, as you'll see later in the story, he can empathize with others because of how he failed. So, all right, Phil, I'm going to make you pick one. You got to pick which is your favorite book?
It's funny you would say my 8-9-year-old, same thing. North or Be Eaten was the one that he always loves to go back to. But Warden and the Wolf King, you know, is like, if we were all going to pick one, I think it's hard to say the end, right? Because you went through the journey. It'd be like the Lord of the Rings. You're going to, you know, read the Return of the King just because it's the culmination of everything. And yet, you know, I guess I look at the thing as just one giant work. I could never just pick one. I look at it as like one big giant book.
Yeah. And what I appreciate, and I think, you know, the tale of a good story is it's not one you're just going to read once and be done with. Like the Lord of the Rings has lasting power because there's so much in there. And I felt like the story just kept getting better and better, which is rare to find. You know, when a great movie comes out and everybody, you know, hits the box office and then they got to make a sequel because, you know, the first one was so successful. It's very rare that it keeps getting more and more successful. But as I said earlier, Andrew Peterson, you could see his development as a person when he's writing these stories, and it can get dark sometimes. He doesn't hide pain. He doesn't hide suffering. He doesn't hide the hurts of the world, which I appreciated. Some people, if you read the reviews, actually didn't like the ending, but I thought the ending was brilliant. It was genius, and I thought it tied everything. Sometimes you just feel like you're left with so many unanswered things, and he does leave some unanswered questions, but in a good way. Yeah. But he ties everything together where you're wondering, like, how did this character come to that? And so I thought that his character development, like you said, was really well. And The Monster in the Hollows was one of my
Yeah,
My favorites.
I like that one too. That's definitely okay. If I was going to pick the one to answer your question, frankly, I would probably say I love the first one because I love the introduction to the whole world. So there's something really fun about how he introduces you to this world of Scree and the sea dragons and the people of the town and this backstory, and then you're left with Pete the sock man waiting to see what's.
I think he actually said he wanted like a combination of Lord of the Rings and Princess Bride, like the humor.
He says
and
that somewhere. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and so it's
funny,
so that's good. Monster in the Hollow is so fun because you get the Hollows folk and you get this whole I love Vikings. I love that whole sort of history of our past that's so unexplored that he's kind of touching into about this wilderness, this folk, these people that have stayed isolated from the conflict, and yet they're faced with it, right? Again, there's another, you wonder, is his influence from the Rohirrim from Lord of the Rings, how they, while they had to then coop up and there was the big bat, there's so many analogies you go through and be like, I see where you get influenced by that. Mm-hmm. But I would go Edge of Darkness, Monster in the Hollow, Warden the Wookiees. Northrop Eaton would probably be my last one.
That's what I actually said. But then I look back and I'm like, but they're so good. Like the Fork Factory. Like the Fork Factory was so good.
You're right. But see, the Fork Factory they don't finally finalize that till later on, right? Till like Warden and the Wolf King.
It might be Warden and the Wolf King.
Yes, it is.
They have a whole section on it. Yeah.
They return to the Fork Factory.
Yeah. But the Black Carriage and all that stuff, like you said, it's really hard to talk about a book without giving away answers. And that's why I can't really tell you why my favorite part of the monster is, especially as fathers and husbands, it's hard not to talk about the monster and the hollows.
I know what you're talking about. And that's actually, my friends who introduced me to the book. That's his favorite part, is what you're alluding to.
Yeah. You know what? I would have to say, as far as reveals go, Monster in the Hollow and Warden the Wolf King are probably parallel, because Monster in the Hollow, that culmination point is just powerful. Yeah.
And when I find an artist that I like Andrew Peterson, and I start looking him up, and then I start listening to all his music and stuff, but you get on YouTube and I like to hear their perspective on when they're writing the story. And if you listen to him, he's like, I don't know how this book's going to go. As he's writing it, he's trying to figure out the character development. He's trying to figure out the story himself, and he's struggling with it. And being an author is hard. He said, that you have to be crazy to be an author and sit down and try to put yourself in this world. But it's just really neat. I think he brings, like you said, you can't just pick one book because it's one big story that flows together so well. And I'm excited that I think they're trying to make movies out of these books, which would just be, I hope they do a good job with it, because if they bring it together like Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, I think it just can be really
epic. If the right people got a hold of this and could make it, it would be phenomenal.
And with the age groups, it would blow up theaters, because you can have, and because it's good, but there's also some violence in it, but it's all ordered to a good thing and to teach good versus evil. And I think it would. To me, it seems like it's a no-brainer for someone to produce it, because it's such a good story. And everybody that I've ever talked to, that I've suggested it to, or that I've found that has read it, every single person, I've never heard someone negative. I've heard some negative pieces about it, but never the story being. Yeah.
Well, according to my son, that if one of our business ventures, becomes wildly successful, that is what he wants to do. His job is he said he will take that task up.
That's awesome. We need movie makers and people that create great media, because one of the things Andrew Peterson talks about a lot, and if you listen to his music, it's not mainstream that you're going to hear on Christian radio and stuff like that. But he created this ministry actually called the Rabbit Room that brings in people that want to create, because like you said, we need great creative. Sometimes you get the perception of the cheesy Christian movies, and they're just too blatant, and Tolkien talks about that, like kind of despise the direct analogies and making things too obvious and kind of too cheesy. Like Tolkien was one of the greatest evangelists, because he told a story that everybody's going to watch, and they have no idea they're being evangelized, but it's a story about Catholicism, and he says that it's just soaked in Catholicism. And I think these stories are soaked in virtue and Christianity in a sense, but they're not blatantly done that way. So I think we need people to make great art in a way that's attractive and that teaches people truth without being too obvious about it.
Well, one thing I want to point out, Matt, that you said I never thought about, but you're 100% correct. And that is the emotional story that's told in here. And as you were speaking, I was reflecting on how, it's so true that part of the challenge of the culture today is getting in touch with our emotion, right? As I alluded to earlier, the Marvel movies do what? They distract us with adrenaline. They don't dive into the heart of the story, the heart of the characters, to where you see that their emotional vulnerability and the ability to communicate that emotional vulnerability is where true connection is made. And that's only because I'm looking at the lens of, like as a doctor, as somebody who takes care of people, that doctor-patient relationship is embodied in a sense of vulnerability. You see this all the time. People tell you their life story, and there's few other professions where that happens. Our culture is more disconnected, right?
I don't get that in IT.
But that's where, Facebook and social media, the lie there is, I'm quote connecting, but you're not, because there's not a personal encounter, right? It's like you're trying to read in. So I think you're exactly right. I look at these books, and the value of these books that give my kids is that they're getting a chance to see siblings who go through one of the hardest things anybody can go through emotionally. And you're on that emotional journey, and there's anger, there's frustration, there's picking on, there's all these things you deal with in a family, and yet they're able to reconcile and unite, forgive and redeem and unify around a cause. And that's what any family should try and do. Every family is going to have stuff they go through. Divorce rates are high. There's so much sin out there, but yet the ability for us to forgive and to move forward and to forget, like that ability is what's not talked about, right? How much forgiveness do you see in the movies? Like real forgiveness,
right?
That's not modeled. That's not demonstrated, right?
Yeah.
And
unless you're watching Pure Flicks or something like that, that's
no, you're right. But look, they're growing. I mean, look what they've got their own, they've got their own thing, because people want that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I just want to say, I agree with you 100%. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because I never saw that, but I just want to echo that 100% and saying that is something that I know over the last year, me and Courtney as parents have, are you familiar with The Whole Brain Child? Oh, okay. That's a different discussion for a different day.
Another podcast topic.
Oh yeah. That dives deep into your child in awesome, profound. That's another book that's like shaking everything up and so forth.
Interesting.
But bottom line is this: being in touch with your children's emotions and helping them know how to articulate that and to manage those is central.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of the 5 love languages?
Yes. So yes.
My wife, that's like her favorite book in the world.
That was one of my wife's favorite books.
So she's always talking about, we need to understand how these kids love and how we as couple love, so that you can give them the kind of love they need. And I think that throughout this book series, that's what they talk about, is that they're finding their love language, how each one needs to love each other and what they need to feel loved. And then on top of that, I think the overarching theme of the whole series is just hope. Because I think so many times they're thinking about giving up. I can't go on. And some people do, in some sense, give up. But they endure, and it's the same way with Catholicism, It's tempting to look around the world and say, this is a pit of sin, like how can God make anything good of this? There's bad things happening all the time, but we know the victory's been won, and we have to have that hope of the better that's at the end, and I think that this book series, they do such a good job of drawing that out and helping you see that. And it's the same way with our faith life, it just, I think that's what, when you walk away after finishing the final book and you just kind of take a breath, that's to me the theme that really came out.
Yeah, it's real and it's authentic, and it talks about real struggles. And like when I finished each of the books, I just remember just sitting there and just thinking, and it hit me in a real powerful way. Like, this is real stuff. This is real life. And I think Andrew Peterson has a way of tugging at your soul a little bit, which is what good stories I think are supposed to do. So really awesome stories. Just to kind of summarize the book sequences again. First book, On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness, is kind of the start off the series, and then North or Be Eaten, and then it goes to the Monster in the Hollows, and the Warden and the Wolf King kind of wraps up the whole story. And reading this as a family was powerful. Reading it individually is powerful. There's different ways to go through the story. We also, on a vacation, they're in audiobooks as well. Andrew Peterson actually narrates the second 2 books in the audiobooks, and he's so talented with his voice and the characters, just unbelievable if you've listened to the audiobooks. I
haven't, and I was just thinking that's one of my favorite parts of reading out loud, is because you get to make up voices. And sometimes, especially for the little kids, you're helping them shape their imagination. Because, especially the real little kids, you don't know how to imagine. You don't know those. Inherently, you don't do that until you hit a certain age, whatever that is. But I think that as adults, it's fun for us to kind of get in that role and play the kid almost, and I love that. I read a quote one time that said, that people would stand in line for hours, pay hundreds of dollars, if there was a pill that would do for what reading out loud does to them. Yeah. And I think that's so true. And it kind of goes back to, to what you were talking about earlier, just all the benefits of it. And I think if you're looking for a book to read out loud to your kids, this series is a great place to start.
He designed it like that. He says that. I think in one interview I listened on him, he said, the chapters are short.
They're short and they're meant to be read out loud. And you can read it obviously in lots of different ways or listen to it. But for us, it was really powerful as a family to sit down. And he's a dad, is one that my wife is amazing at reading, but I kind of struggle with. But this was one where I really felt connected with my kids each night. It was great, but you're right. Tons of research out there. Reading out loud with your kids, one of the best things you can do to help them grow physically, emotionally, intellectually. It's just overall very, very healthy for them. So we can't recommend high enough Andrew Peterson, Wingfeather Saga, and I'm sure in future episodes we'll talk about other favorite stories that we have and help us grow in our faith.
I will plug before we finish. Did you guys know there's another piece to the puzzle of this? It's called the Wingfeather Tales.
Yes,
have you read that?
We did read that. It was all right.
Yeah,
I won't give it nearly as high ratings as the Andrew Peterson.
It's a bolt-on. It's kind of side stories.
Yeah,
but it's interesting. It's
in the same world. So he's created a world, and so other offers.
The backstory of Poto Helmer is kind of cool.
Yeah,
that gives you a little bit more background.
He's my favorite character. That's my favorite character, Poto.
Yeah, the grandfather. So many characters you can focus on and pull out, and everybody's got ways of doing that. So
we'll have to do. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I also did See This for People. These books are somewhat hard to come by, the paperback, but because they're not reprinting them right now. They are coming out with new hardback and new drawings, new illustrations, and that comes out in March. I saw.
Got mine on order.
Yeah, and so
I didn't know this.
Yes.
So there's March 10th, the first two books come out, and then September 10th or sometime in September, the final two, and they're hardback this time and new illustrations. So I'll also be buying them because this is my set of books, and they're very beat up. I've got a lot of tape on them because the kids have gone through them, and it's just...
That's the sign of a classic book, is the tape all over the book.
Right.
So, yeah, go ahead, Phil.
You'll have to ask yourself, at what point do we get to come back and have another podcast where we just go through the book, where we don't have to worry about spoilers, and we can just dissect.
Yeah.
We'll have to do that.
So maybe that's like in a few months.
You got a couple months to read the book, and then we're going to come back and tell you all the answers. So hopefully we've whet people's appetite enough that these books are amazing. They're awesome. They're some of my favorite books as a just an individual, but my family's, my kids, all give them right up there. My kids are infatuated with Tolkien, so they won't put him as high as Tolkien, but they're right up there with J.R.R. Tolkien. So go out, get copies, Wingfeather Saga. Can't recommend it high enough. So we're going to sign off for today on the Extraordinary Mission podcast, but just want to remind you that you're all made to be saints, so just try your best and trust in God's grace to do all the rest.
The Extraordinary Mission podcast was brought to you by the Deep Roots Club, a group of people investing their time, talent, and treasures into helping today's families build deep roots of faith that can weather any storm. Find out more at www.extraordinarymission.com/get-involved.